The United States will officially bring an end to World War II with the detonation of the first nuclear weapons on Imperial Japan on August 6 and 9, 1945. Almost immediately, tensions between the former allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, begin to escalate. The period known as the Cold War was a time when these two superpowers stockpiled weapons and experimented on building more powerful nuclear weapons. The Cold War could have easily turned into a nuclear conflict if it weren't for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which was beneficial for the peaceful use of nuclear technology, even outside of de-escalating the Cold War. A brief historical recap. The initial efforts to create a treaty for nuclear weapons began in 1946. This attempt failed, but in 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower urged that an international agreement be made for nuclear technology to be used for peaceful purposes instead of destructive ones. His proposal prompted the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which both enforces the control and promotion of nuclear weapons. It was evident that more needed to be done, however, and the principle of nuclear non-proliferation was addressed and discussed as early as 1957. Hence, the idea of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was created and discussed every 5 years by a review conference and finally launched and signed in 1968 with the following principles. 1. Nuclear non-proliferation, meaning one was not able to acquire more nuclear weapons nor send them to non-nuclear weapon states. 2. Disarmament, the reduction or withdrawal of nuclear military forces. And 3. The right to peacefully use nuclear technology. By 1993, 191 countries had signed the treaty, including 5 nuclear weapon states: the USA, the UK, France, Russia, and China. That leaves only 4 countries that had not signed the NPT, showing how monumental this treaty was and how its influence was international. As previously mentioned, before the treaty's creation, there was an ongoing tension known as the Cold War. It wasn't yet an actual full-blown war, but could have easily become one, seeing as the relationship between the two former allies, the Soviet Union and the United States, was very tense, and both were stockpiling nuclear weapons. If they had decided to use them against one another, destruction on a literally nuclear level would have desecrated the Soviet Union and US, if not for the NPT. After its signing, the two tense superpowers actually cooperated to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons and slow the escalation of the ongoing Cold War. Even beyond this, the NPT served to limit the creation of nuclear weapons across all countries to have signed the treaty. South Africa signed the treaty in 1991 after the dismantling of its own small arsenal of nuclear weapons. Argentina and Brazil agreed to the treaty after they mutually agreed to cease their nuclear activities. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine became members after they gave up their nuclear weapons in 1991. While many of these examples were prompted by other reasons besides the NPT, their acceding to the treaty cemented their decisions and made the world a little safer and a little less threatened by the destruction a nuclear weapon could cause. And you might wonder how effective the NPT really was, because couldn't countries just cheat and pursue nuclear weapons while remaining NPT parties? Well, you'd be right and wrong. Some did cheat, but had to do so covertly, constraining their efforts. In a few more recent cases, Libya, after nearly 30 years of pursuing nuclear weapons, gave up its efforts in 2003 due to the diplomatic efforts of the US and UK, and a change of heart by the country's leader. North Korea, which withdrew in 2003, did so facing international sanctions and political isolation. This just goes to show how impactful the NPT was. Even if one may argue over its imperfections, it was still extremely beneficial and important to the decreasing of nuclear threat, the most prominent of said threats being the tensions between the Soviet Union and US in the Cold War. It broke the barriers of the threat of nuclear weapons worldwide and eradicated the barrier the two superpowers' nuclear stockpiles had created between a world less threatened by nuclear weapons and the Cold War. In the context of the Cold War arms race and mounting international concern about the consequences of nuclear war, the treaty was a major success for advocates of arms control because it set a precedent for international cooperation between nuclear and non-nuclear states to prevent proliferation. The NPT by itself may seem insignificant, but due to the whopping amounts of countries that signed it, the NPT sparked international cooperation, helping the world recognize the threat of nuclear weapons and work together to stop them. This cooperation included the Soviet Union and the United States, and also let them know that, quote, the rest of the world would not tolerate the presence of their menacing nuclear arsenals any longer. This forced them to cease the proliferation of their weapons and thereby cease the very real threat of a destructive nuclear war. In conclusion, The Non-Proliferation Treaty of Nuclear Weapons was an extremely monumental and important treaty in the prevention of the spread and threat of nuclear weapons. The NPT was created in the period of time known as the Cold War and caused the two tenth superpowers, the US and Russian Soviet Union, to withdraw their nuclear arsenals and join forces to decrease the risk of nuclear bombings. The treaty is beneficial and thorough and was nothing else but a huge cornerstone in the ultimate goal of preventing the use of nuclear weapons and other explosive nuclear technologies.